October 23, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Across thousands of square miles of tropical ocean, the largest assemblage of naval power in human history converges for a climactic showdown. More than 200,000 sailors man vessels ranging from tiny patrol boats to massive battleships displacing 70,000 tons. The Imperial Japanese Navy, facing annihilation, commits virtually its entire surviving fleet to one desperate gamble. The United States Navy, confident in its overwhelming superiority, moves to crush its enemy once and for all. At stake is nothing less than the fate of the Pacific War. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur are landing on Leyte Island in the Philippines, fulfilling his promise to return. The Japanese High Command understands that losing the Philippines means losing access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the lifeblood of their war machine. Without oil, the fleet cannot sail, the aircraft cannot fly, the tanks cannot move. Japan will be strangled. The Japanese plan is audacious to the point of desperation. 3 separate naval forces will converge on Leyte Gulf in a coordinated assault, overwhelming American defenses and destroying the invasion fleet. To succeed, they must deceive the Americans, divide their forces, and achieve tactical surprise despite facing an enemy with superior numbers, better aircraft, and radar that can see in darkness. What unfolds over 4 days in October 1944 will be the largest naval battle ever fought. Multiple engagements spanning hundreds of miles, involving aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and aircraft. It will witness the last battleship versus battleship action in history, the first organized kamikaze attacks, acts of extraordinary courage, moments of confusion and controversial decisions, and ultimately, the effective destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. This is the story of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, 4 interconnected battles that determined the course of the Pacific War and marked the death throes of a once mighty fleet. By October 1944, Japan's strategic position had become desperate. Since the disaster at Midway in June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a relentless series of defeats. The Solomons campaign consumed irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, decimated Japanese naval aviation, with over 600 aircraft destroyed and 3 fleet carriers sunk. American submarines strangled Japanese shipping, sending tankers and supply vessels to the bottom faster than they could be replaced. Japan's carrier fleet, once the most powerful in the world, now existed only as hollow shells. The carriers themselves survived, but trained pilots and aircraft to fly from them did not. Years of attrition had killed the experienced aircrews, and Japan's pilot training program could not replace losses. Fuel shortages meant new pilots received minimal flight time before being thrown into combat. The result was catastrophic. Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive weapon. But Japan still possessed powerful surface combatants. The battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest ever built, displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded and carried 18.1-inch guns, the most powerful naval rifles ever mounted. Heavy cruisers, fleet cruisers, and destroyers remained in commission, many of them modern and capable vessels. If these ships could reach the vulnerable American transport and supply vessels at Leyte Gulf, they could massacre the invasion fleet. Admiral Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, devised Operation Shogo, Victory Operation. The plan called for maximum deception and divided forces. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would command the northern force, the surviving aircraft carriers with few aircraft aboard, as a decoy to lure the powerful American fast carrier task forces away from Leyte Gulf. With the carriers gone, 2 powerful surface forces would converge on Leyte from different directions and destroy the invasion fleet. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would lead the center force, the most powerful component, including the super-battleships Yamato and Musashi, 3 other battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. This force would transit the Sibuyan Sea, pass through San Bernardino Strait north of Samar, then turn south to attack the landing beaches from the north. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would command the southern force, 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers, approaching through Surigao Strait south of Leyte. A separate small force under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima would follow Nishimura through Surigao Strait. The Japanese hoped that attacking from multiple directions simultaneously would overwhelm American defenses. The plan depended entirely on Ozawa's carriers successfully luring away Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet, the fast carrier task forces that represented American naval aviation power. If Halsey took the bait and chased the Japanese carriers north, the American landing beaches would be vulnerable to surface attack. If Halsey didn't take the bait, Kurita's center force would face devastating air attacks from American carriers. Everything depended on deception, timing, and coordination. The Americans, meanwhile, possessed overwhelming force. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet included 16 fast carriers, 6 new fast battleships, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet supported the Leyte landings with 6 older battleships, 16 escort carriers, and hundreds of smaller vessels. American submarines prowled potential Japanese approach routes. American aircraft controlled the skies. American radar could detect enemy ships at night and in bad weather. The Japanese were outgunned, outmatched, and facing an enemy that could see them coming. But war is never certain. Confusion, mistakes, communication failures, and the fog of battle could create opportunities even for an inferior force. The Japanese were desperate, willing to sacrifice everything for one chance to strike a decisive blow. The stage was set for the greatest naval battle in history. The first blow fell not from aircraft or big guns, but from American submarines lurking along the approaches to the Philippines. On the morning of October 23, the submarines USS Darter and USS Dace were patrolling the Palawan Passage when they detected Kurita's center force, the main Japanese striking force, steaming toward the Philippines. Commander David McClintock aboard USS Darter and Commander Bladen Claggett aboard USS Dace tracked the Japanese fleet through the night, positioning themselves for attack. At dawn on October 23, they struck with devastating effect. Darter fired 6 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship. 4 torpedoes slammed into the cruiser, which sank in 18 minutes. Kurita and his staff were forced to swim for their lives, rescued by a destroyer. The admiral transferred his flag to the battleship Yamato, but he had lost his flagship and spent crucial hours out of communication. Darter then targeted the heavy cruiser Takao, hitting her with 2 torpedoes that crippled the ship, forcing her to limp back toward Brunei. Meanwhile, Dace fired 4 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Maya, scoring 4 hits. Maya exploded and sank in 4 minutes. In the span of one morning, American submarines had sunk 2 heavy cruisers, crippled a third, and thrown the Japanese command structure into chaos. The submarine attack achieved something perhaps more valuable than the ships sunk. It alerted American commanders that a major Japanese fleet movement was underway. Radio messages from Darter and Dace warned of a powerful enemy force approaching from the west. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had begun. October 24 dawned clear over the Philippine Islands. Kurita's center force, now known to be approaching, steamed through the Sibuyan Sea, the body of water in the center of the Philippine archipelago. American search planes spotted the Japanese fleet, and Admiral Halsey ordered strikes from his fast carriers. Wave after wave of American aircraft attacked throughout the day. Hellcat fighters, Heldover dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers swarmed over the Japanese ships. The super-battleship Musashi became the primary target. American pilots concentrated on the giant battleship, recognizing it as the most powerful unit in the enemy fleet. Musashi absorbed incredible punishment. The first wave scored several bomb and torpedo hits. The second wave added more. By midday, Musashi had taken more than 10 torpedo hits and numerous bomb strikes, yet she continued steaming forward, her guns still firing. American pilots reported in amazement that the giant ship refused to die. But no ship could withstand such punishment indefinitely. By mid-afternoon, after absorbing an estimated 19 torpedo hits and 17 bombs, Musashi began to slow. Her bow dipped lower into the water. Listing heavily to port, her forward turrets nearly underwater, the pride of the Japanese Navy finally capsized and sank at 1935 hours. Over 1,000 sailors went down with her, including her captain. The air attacks also damaged other vessels in Kurita's force. The heavy cruiser Myoko was crippled and forced to withdraw. Other ships suffered varying degrees of damage. Most critically, the relentless air attacks forced Kurita to reverse course temporarily, retreating westward away from San Bernardino Strait. American pilots reported the Japanese force in retreat. But appearances deceived. Kurita had not abandoned the mission. After the air attacks ceased at nightfall, he reversed course again, heading back toward San Bernardino Strait. His force had been bloodied but remained powerful. 4 battleships including the mighty Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. They pressed forward through the night toward their objective. Far to the south, Nishimura's southern force approached Surigao Strait, moving to attack the American landing areas from the south. And far to the north, Admiral Ozawa's carrier force, the decoy, finally succeeded in attracting American attention. Search planes spotted the Japanese carriers, and Admiral Halsey made his fateful decision. Admiral William Bull Halsey faced one of the war's most difficult tactical decisions. Reports indicated that Kurita's center force had been badly mauled and was retreating. The threat from that direction appeared to be contained, but now Japanese carriers had been spotted to the north. The very carriers whose aircraft had struck Pearl Harbor, had dominated the Pacific in 1942, represented the core of Japanese naval power. Halsey believed the carriers were the primary threat and the priority target. His staff argued that destroying the Japanese carrier force would eliminate Japan's ability to project naval air power. The fact that the carriers had few aircraft seemed less important than their symbolic and potential threat. Halsey also believed that the old battleships of 7th Fleet guarding Surigao Strait could handle any surface threat from the south. At 20:22 hours on October 24, Halsey made his decision. He would take all 3 of his fast carrier groups and his fast battleships north to attack Ozawa's carriers. He would leave San Bernardino Strait, Kurita's route to the landing beaches, completely unguarded. Not a single American ship would be positioned to oppose Kurita if the Japanese force emerged through the strait. Halsey's reasoning seemed sound. Kurita appeared to be retreating. The carriers to the north were a threat that needed elimination. His powerful force could destroy the Japanese carriers, while the 7th Fleet dealt with the southern force at Surigao Strait. But Halsey's decision rested on assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. Kurita was not retreating. He was merely pausing before resuming his advance through San Bernardino Strait. The Japanese carriers, while certainly targets worth destroying, were nearly toothless, carrying only about 100 aircraft among them compared to Halsey's 600+. The real threat was not the carriers to the north, but the powerful surface force approaching San Bernardino Strait from the west. Admiral Kinkaid, commanding 7th Fleet, believed Halsey had left a powerful surface force guarding San Bernardino Strait. Halsey believed Kinkaid was guarding the strait. In reality, no one was guarding it. Communication failures and assumptions meant that a massive gap in American defenses existed, and Kurita's battleships and cruisers were heading straight for it. October 24-25. While confusion reigned regarding San Bernardino Strait, American forces prepared to meet the southern force approaching through Surigao Strait. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded the defense, 6 old battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 28 destroyers, and 39 PT boats. Many of the battleships were Pearl Harbor survivors: California, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, returning to exact revenge. The Americans set a trap. PT boats would attack first, harassing the Japanese as they entered the strait. Destroyer squadrons would execute torpedo runs from both flanks. Then the big ships, the battleships and cruisers, would be waiting at the northern end of the strait, deployed in a classic naval tactic called crossing the T. The Japanese ships, steaming in column, would be able to fire only their forward guns, while the American ships deployed broadside could fire full broadsides. It was a naval commander's dream scenario. Admiral Nishimura's force entered Surigao Strait after midnight on October 25, 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, 1 heavy cruiser and 4 destroyers. Following behind came Admiral Shima's smaller force. The Japanese knew they were sailing into a trap, but their orders were clear: press forward and attack the American landing areas. The battle unfolded exactly as Oldendorf planned. PT boats made contact first, launching torpedoes that missed but alerted the Japanese to American presence. Then American destroyer squadrons attacked from both sides, their torpedoes scoring devastating hits. The battleship Fuso was hit and broke in 2, both halves burning fiercely. 3 Japanese destroyers were sunk or crippled. At 3:53 hours, the American battleships opened fire. Radar-directed gunnery allowed accurate shooting in total darkness. West Virginia fired first, her 16-inch shells straddling the Japanese flagship Yamashiro at 22,800 yards. California, Tennessee, and Maryland joined in. The concentrated fire was overwhelming. Yamashiro, already damaged by torpedo hits, absorbed dozens of 16-inch and 14-inch shells. She capsized and sank at 4:19 hours, taking Admiral Nishimura and most of her crew to the bottom. The heavy cruiser Megami, badly damaged, retreated south. Admiral Shima's following force, arriving to find the strait full of burning wreckage, wisely decided to withdraw. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over in less than 3 hours. American firepower had destroyed the Japanese southern force with minimal losses. It was the last time in history that battleships would fight battleships in a line-of-battle engagement. But while this victory unfolded, catastrophe loomed elsewhere. October 25, David versus Goliath. Dawn on October 25 revealed Admiral Kurita's center force emerging from San Bernardino Strait, completely unopposed. Halsey was far to the north chasing carriers. The only American forces between Kurita's battleships and the vulnerable transports in Leyte Gulf were 3 groups of escort carriers, nicknamed Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, with their destroyer escorts. Escort carriers were tiny compared to fleet carriers, converted merchant hulls carrying about 30 aircraft each, designed for anti-submarine work and close air support, not fleet combat. They were slow, lightly armored, and armed with only a few 5-inch guns. Their destroyer escorts were equally ill-equipped to face battleships. Yet these small ships were all that stood between Kurita's force and the American landing beaches. At 6:45 hours, lookouts on Taffy 3 spotted pagoda masts on the horizon. Moments later, massive splashes erupted around the carriers as Japanese heavy cruisers opened fire. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, faced an impossible situation. His 6 escort carriers and 7 small escorts confronted 4 Japanese battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, the most powerful surface force in the Pacific. Sprague ordered his carriers to flee eastward at maximum speed while launching all available aircraft. He ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts to attack the Japanese force, a suicidal mission against vastly superior opponents. What followed was one of the most gallant actions in naval history. The destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, charged toward the Japanese fleet alone, laying smoke to screen the carriers while firing guns and launching torpedoes. Johnston scored torpedo hits on the heavy cruiser Kumano, knocking her out of action. Japanese ships concentrated fire on the American destroyer, pounding her with shells. Johnston fought back with her 5-inch guns against battleship armor, a futile but heroic gesture. The destroyer USS Hull and the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts joined the attack. Roberts, a tiny ship with only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes, charged straight at Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers. Her crew fired over 600 5-inch shells, nearly exhausting the ship's entire ammunition supply, scoring hits on Japanese cruisers. She launched her torpedoes, then continued fighting with guns until Japanese shells tore her apart. The escort carrier's aircraft attacked relentlessly despite having been armed for ground support rather than naval combat. Pilots made dummy runs when they ran out of ammunition, diving at Japanese ships to distract them and disrupt their fire. Some pilots flew so low they could see Japanese sailors on deck. Every minute these desperate attacks continued gave the fleeing carriers more time to escape. The Japanese, surprisingly, seemed confused. Kurita believed he was facing fleet carriers and heavy cruisers rather than escort carriers and destroyers. The ferocious resistance convinced him he faced a much larger force. American smoke screens and rain squalls obscured visibility. Individual Japanese ships became separated, reducing coordination. Instead of an organized pursuit, the battle became a confused melee. After 2.5 hours of intense combat, with several escort carriers sinking or damaged and his escorts shot to pieces, Admiral Sprague expected annihilation. Then, incredibly, the Japanese turned away. Kurita, confused about American dispositions, worried about air attacks, and believing his force was being drawn into a trap, ordered a withdrawal at 9:11 hours. The most powerful surface force in the Pacific turned back, just as victory seemed within reach. The battle off Samar cost the Americans dearly. The escort carriers Gambier Bay sent low to kamikaze attack, and several destroyers were sunk. Over 1,000 sailors died, but they had achieved the impossible, stopping a vastly superior force through courage, aggressive action, and the confusion of battle. The transports in Leyte Gulf were saved. Far to the north, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet finally caught up with Admiral Azawa's carrier force off Cape Engano. Azawa's mission, to act as a decoy and draw the American carriers away from Leyte, had succeeded perfectly, though at terrible cost. His carriers had few aircraft, and those they launched were quickly shot down by superior American pilots. American carrier aircraft attacked in waves throughout October 25. The Japanese carriers, nearly defenseless without effective air cover, were sitting targets. The carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda were sunk, along with several other ships. It was a lopsided slaughter. Azawa's force was annihilated, but his mission had succeeded. He had drawn Halsey north, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. When Halsey finally received urgent messages about the crisis off Samar, his fast battleships were hundreds of miles north of the action. He turned south at maximum speed, but arrived too late to intercept Kurita's retreating force. The battle off Cape Engano had been a tactical victory for the Americans, 4 Japanese carriers destroyed, but strategically, it represented a near-catastrophic error in judgment. By October 26, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. The Japanese had committed virtually their entire remaining fleet and lost catastrophically. 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships including the mighty Musashi, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers had been sunk. Approximately 12,000 Japanese sailors were dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy as an offensive force had ceased to exist. American losses, while significant, were comparatively light. 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and approximately 3,000 dead. The disparity in losses reflected both American superiority in numbers and technology, and the success of Japanese deception in dividing American forces at critical moments. The strategic consequences were immense. Japan had gambled everything on Operation Shogo and lost. Without a functioning fleet, Japan could no longer contest American naval operations. The Philippines would be reconquered. The sea lanes to the Dutch East Indies were cut. Japan's strategic position became hopeless. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had effectively decided the naval war in the Pacific. But controversy swirled around Admiral Halsey's decision to pursue the Japanese carriers north, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Critics argued he had fallen for an obvious decoy, abandoning his primary mission, protecting the landing forces, to pursue a secondary objective. The near disaster off Samar, they claimed, resulted directly from Halsey's decision. Halsey's defenders countered that destroying enemy carriers was always the priority, that he couldn't have known the carriers were toothless decoys, and that the confusion resulted partly from unclear command relationships and communication failures between 3rd Fleet and 7th Fleet. The debate continued for decades, with historians divided on whether Halsey's decision was a reasonable calculation that happened to go wrong or a fundamental error in judgment. What was undeniable was the extraordinary courage displayed by the sailors and aviators of Taffy 3 off Samar. Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of USS Samuel B. Roberts and many others received high decorations. Their desperate stand against impossible odds entered naval legend as one of the most gallant actions in American naval history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was unprecedented in scale. Across an area of 100,000 square miles, over 200,000 sailors participated in multiple interconnected engagements. It was the largest naval battle in history by virtually any measure: ships involved, tonnage engaged, area covered, duration. It marked several lasts and firsts: the last battleship versus battleship engagement, the first organized kamikaze attacks, the last major fleet action of World War II. The battle demonstrated that technological superiority, when combined with overwhelming numbers, could compensate for mistakes and confusion. American radar, superior damage control, better aircraft, more numerous ships, and trained crews provided decisive advantages. The Japanese fought with courage and desperation, but courage alone could not overcome material inferiority. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, Leyte Gulf was the end. The surviving ships returned to port and would never sortie in strength again. Fuel shortages, lack of aircraft and pilots, and American air superiority meant the remaining vessels would spend the war's final months as floating batteries or kite, suicide submarine platforms. The tradition-rich combined fleet, which had once dominated the Pacific, had fought its last major battle. For the United States Navy, victory at Leyte Gulf ensured continued freedom of action in the Pacific. MacArthur's Philippines campaign would proceed unhindered by naval threats. The invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa became possible. The final blockade and bombardment of the Japanese home islands could proceed. Naval supremacy had been achieved and would not be challenged again. The Battle of Leyte Gulf remains a subject of study in naval war colleges worldwide. It teaches lessons about divided command, communication under stress, the importance of reconnaissance, the value of aggressive action even by inferior forces, and the danger of deception operations. The controversy over Halsey's decisions reminds commanders that even overwhelming force must be employed wisely, that missions must be clearly defined and understood, and that assumptions in warfare can prove fatal. But beyond strategy and tactics, beyond controversy and analysis, the Battle of Leyte Gulf represents human drama on an epic scale: sailors fighting for survival in burning ships, pilots attacking impossible odds, commanders making split-second decisions with thousands of lives hanging in the balance, courage and fear, triumph and tragedy, all compressed into 4 days of combat across the Philippine Sea. It was history's greatest naval battle, and it would be the last of its kind. the end of an era of naval warfare dominated by big guns and fleet actions, giving way to a new age of carrier aviation, missiles, and submarines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the culmination of a century of battleship development and the final chapter in the history of the battle line. After Leyte Gulf, naval warfare would never be the same.